we're going to be talking about in situ rubidium strontium, and it's got some similarities analytically to lutetium hafnium, but it's quite a different beast altogether. And I'm going to start you with, I mean, you would have heard some of this stuff this morning, but I'm going to start you with a little bit of a history, brief history lesson, if you like, that takes us back 120 odd years ago. And it started with a couple of guys, a couple of Brits, third Britain there too, and they did some of the first geopron work ever on uranium, thorium, helium, and uranium lead of natural minerals. And that happened in 1905. About a year later, a couple of other bright sparks discovered that this particular element, rubidium, was radioactive. But it took about another 30 years before they discovered that it was isotope number 87 that was responsible for that radioactivity. And shortly after that, they were able to do the first real attempt at dating of these rubidium strontium minerals in the middle of World War II. One thing I'll mention as well is sort of concurrent with this and sort of almost competing with it at the time, because they're very similar properties, is you've got potassium argon also happening. Now, rubidium is normally a trace element, or trace or minor element, if you like, in potassium-bearing minerals, right? They're both group 1 elements. If you see my little mug at the back, you'll see them in the same column on the periodic table, right? So if you got a lot of potassium in there, you'll have a little bit of rubidium. Exactly how much depends on the mineral, but you'll have some. And so often the two will give you almost the same answer. As Bruno said, sometimes based on subtle differences, depending on whether you look at metamorphic things, they might give you a different answer, but often they give you the same thing. Fast forward a decade to the 1950s, and you've got mass spectrometers that are being developed, and they're able to then take this thing to the next level. We look at sort of the next 50 years on top of that, and one of the very important stages in terms of rubidium strontium in its demise at the time was the development of argon-argon. It was taking that potassium isotope, sticking it in a nuclear reactor. So that's a little image of the inside of one of these nuclear reactors, and converting your potassium to argon. You're able to measure the age of something by measuring the same isotopic system, the same element at least, using only a single step. Previously, and you still do for potassium argon, you've got to take your sample and you've got to split it into potassium one method, argon another method. And that's A, time consuming, but B, it also brings a lot of assumptions into play. And then again, in the late 70s and early 80s, you have uranium lead shrimp. We've heard lots of talk about this already today. But these things really, these two, the combination of in situ techniques and high precision ages of potassium bearing minerals meant that rubidium strontium and potassium argon fell off a cliff. Nobody was interested in anymore. About the mid-1990s, all the labs shut down really doing things because there was really no point for it anymore. Right? We could get either a higher precision in situ measurement or a more precise number from different radiometric techniques. One last thing I'll mention, this is a very important step in the revival of rubidium strontium, is the development of the first nanosecond based laser ablation ICP-MS, which is kind of what we're using at the moment here. And certainly this is a picture of the lab here at Curtin. And in the sort of the last 20 years, rubidium strontium slowly started to creep back up, or at least the potential for rubidium strontium slowly started to creep back up in the early 21st century. People realized that they could actually take what Bruno's already talked about, this reaction cell, and I've got another slide on that in a second, something that's able to put some sort of gas in that's able to take your rubidium, which doesn't like to react with something like oxygen, and your strontium, which does like to react, and then have a mass shift on it. And coupling that with, particularly in 2017, you have these new generation of machines, these triple quads, which I'll explain in a second, that were able to, in 2016 and 17, produce the first in situ rubidium strontium studies. So you no longer have to dissolve it. So you can harness that in situ power that's been around for several decades now for uranium lead, with the ability of, say, potassium bearing minerals that before really couldn't be dated. You know, we could do it in K feldspar with lead, but there's a whole host of other minerals that haven't been able to be dated before in an in situ mechanism. And really harnessing that power of that in situ power to look at things that would otherwise be completely unresolvable if you were to crush up the rock. Right? You lose all that textural information, you lose You can, pick out individual grains, but how do you know where they've come from, right? Being able to resolve those things. Now, why the heck would we care about dating potassium-bearing minerals, right? Why can't we just stick with uranium? Well, there's a range of different applications. And Bruno's already talked about some of these lately, is in terms of understanding the metamorphic terrains and the crustal evolution. Right, he talked about garnet, and that's a relatively high temperature mineral. While things like the micas, K feldspar, those minerals will lose their radiogenic isotopes rather quickly at very low temperatures, sort of in the few hundred degrees. So we can start to understand the low temperature, or the low to medium temperature, Mark say that's fairly high, temperature history of a particular rock. We can also look at it in terms of mineralization processes. Often things like vein systems or sometimes fault reactivations don't have uranium-bearing minerals that participate in those reactions. So you need something that you can date that has maybe potassium. We can look at it, particularly in Precambrian settings, in terms of when were sediments deposited, when were sedimentary rocks deposited. In the Phanerozoic, you've got fossils, but what happens when you go into Precambrian? I mean, you could try something like xenotime, but that's painstaking to do. And Milo touched on this, or Milo explained some of this, is you can also use it as another mineral to be able to do provenance work with, not just solely relying on zircon or other uranium-lead datable minerals. You can do it by adding in more things to the equation. Less arm raving required. More you have. So why can we only do it now? What stopped us for all these years in doing it? Well, the biggest problem with rubidium and strontium, two of the isotopes that we want to date have the same mass. So rubidium-87 decays by beta decay to 87 strontium. Same isotopic mass, right? So they have this, what we call isobaric interference, same mass to charge ratio. There's another complication, less of a complication, but 87 strontium, for example, is not exactly abundant either. It's about 6 to 7% of total strontium. 88 strontium is far more abundant. So this is a little setup of an ICP-MS instrument, but the front end, if you like, is the same as a normal ICP-MS. In fact, this whole front end is the same. What you do especially here is you add this collision cell in here, and then you filter with another quadrupole. So what that looks like is I've got two images here. I've got a normal quadrupole, a normal single 4 magnets happening here, and I've got something that we call a triple quadrupole, which we have downstairs. We've got both downstairs. In a quadrupole, you've got all these different elements, different isotopes, different mass to charge ratios. They come in through, imagine your reaction cell is turned off. They come through and you get various isotopes. Let's say your 87 rubidium, your 87 strontium, and something else comes through. At the end of the day, you've got your mass analyzer here, and you've got your various isotopes that you want to know how much of this yellow guy there is. But you've got all his buddies there that are all giving you the same peak, and so you really can't resolve the difference. What happens now in your triple quadrupole is you say, well, look, let's actually only analyze your mass 87. And what comes through is your 87 rubidium and your 87 strontium. Then you stick in a reaction cell with something like nitrous oxide, oxygen, sulfur hexafluoride, something that is reactive. And then you measure now your 87, which will be your rubidium, 87 rubidium, or you measure what is now strontium oxide, so 87 plus 16, 103. Now you're able to resolve these two peaks. Now you're able to isolate this 87 rubidium from this 87 strontium friend. The way we actually date these things, the way we actually can get an age, is much the same way samarium, neodymium, and lutetium-hafnium is through isochrones. So we have various starting compositions. So, for example, this is a case where you maybe dissolve the crystals, but the same applies in situ. Let's say you got 4 different types of minerals. You got gray, which is the whole rock. You've got red, green, blue, might be feldspar, biotite, muscovite, whatever it might be. And they all, when they form, let's say you got a magmatic rock, they form and they have different amounts of rubidium and some sort of starting amount of 87 strontium, because 87 strontium does not only form by radioactive decay, it's also there as a common strontium product. So everything starts on a flat line, and the slope of that line is 0, and that essentially defines the age. As this system evolves, as it gets older, assuming you've got a closed system, each of these starting compositions will evolve along some sort of trajectory moving in this direction. And if they lie on another line again, the slope of that line defines the age. So generally, normally speaking, the steeper that line is, the older your rock is, the shallower it is, the younger your rock is. And that's for all isotopic systems, all isochronous-based systems. Same. So what I'm going to, so you've had a bit of a background on now. I'll just take you through one little case study. This is something we did a couple of years ago now, but it was at the time the first real study where we could really harness that in situ power on single thin section samples to be able to obtain multiple ages. And it was a collaboration really between a couple of guys here at Curtin and AngloGold Ashanti, who were interested in understanding how gold mineralization, they seem to have recognized two gold mineralizing events at their deposit in the Albany Fraser origin at a deposit called Tropicana. And they wanted to know, were there two gold mineralizing events? How did that impact our exploration model? What did that mean for buying up tenements in performance? If you're unfamiliar with the Albany Fraser origin, and this is it, if you like, Esperance is sitting here, Albany's just off the end here. We're sitting in south, I guess southern Western Australia here. We're sitting in a place called the Plumbridge Terrane on the very sort of northeastern part of the Albany Fraser. And zooming in, each of these little gold diamonds are prospects or deposits for gold. And all these prospects, really the only one that has ever been economic is Tropicana itself. But there's all these little other diamonds that had hints of gold, but weren't kind of at the scale where we could start to find them. There's a couple that are bolded a bit more. These are the couple of samples we had. So we had a couple of samples from Tropicana itself, and a few from some of these prospects at the place. Just to give you a bit of a brief history to see when these ages will, what I'll talk about in a second, will fit into things. At 2700 MA, we're focusing here on this Tropicana zone here. You had crystallization of various felsic and mafic protoliths. That then fairly quickly after that underwent granulite metamorphism at about 2680 to 2540. And what they thought was that all the gold mineralization, based on various previous geochronometers, various uranium lead things, various other things, that all the gold came in solely at 2530. And then the only thing really that's affected here, I mean, you've got the Barron Basin and various other things happening, but specifically in the Plumbridge Terrane, you've really only got a bit of metamorphism and maybe magnetism happening at 1300 and about 1200-ish. That's kind of just a simplified history again. There's a bit more complexity to it, but in general, that's what it is. Now, this is kind of what Anglo American mainly did for us, and we could see the same thing in the thin sections that we got, is you had two assemblages. You've got really importantly, the things that are really important for this is you've got this gold-bearing first generation of pyrite and a gold-bearing second generation of pyrite, and they seem to be intimately associated with two generations of biotite. And so the first generation of biotite looks like these nice, clean, large sheets, whereas the second looks like this very recrystallized sheets. And these little individual blebs sometimes have little tiny bits of quartz in, so all the sort of grayish bits in there are bits of quartz. They occasionally will just have this sort of paler recrystallized texture in there. And if I got that in a bit more detail, what that looks like under the SEM is you sometimes have these what I call clean biotite 1. It looks very homogeneous and backscatter images, whereas the second biotite has these large mixtures of quartz and biotite, or it has these sort of corridors where you get a lot of titanite, you get some sort of rutile that sometimes gets exolved out of it. So microstructurally, it's a lot more complex. When we dated these, and each of these little circles is a laser ablation spot. You notice that we even have two different grain sizes, because this was some of the early work we're doing, so we're still experimenting with what was the optimum kind of conditions. Is we realized two different things. Is we're getting two different populations. One, on the very clean first generation of biotite, we were getting 25, 35, essentially plus minus 20. Pretty much the same age as what previous workers have said. Look, this is the age of Tropicana, here's when all the gold came in. Great. But in some samples, there was a hint of a later event, and in other samples, that event was really well defined at about 12, 10 million years. So seemingly coeval with some of that really late stage processes. It's not cooling related, because otherwise everything else would be reset also at this time. There's something new growing there, or at least something being recrystallized at that time. Now, one of the really interesting findings is that this is one of these satellite prospects called the New Zebra prospect, if you like, that's close by. And we can do the same thing with Muscovite. And despite the enormous large uncertainty, hopefully I can convince you that, broadly speaking, you've got the same age as that younger event. Now, this was quite important because all the satellite prospects only seemed to have this younger event. There was no record that it ever had this older Archean event. And that had some implications for gold prospectivity. One thing I guess we sort of suggested is that first event, the cooling, if you like, of the Yogan craton after granulite fascist metamorphism. Here's some of these other geochronometers that were kind of coeval with it, brought in a major amount of gold. And this second event might have brought in a little bit extra gold or just remobilized some of this existing amount, but really didn't do a hell of a lot, right? And so this image on the right here is a, if you like, a combination of from all the different samples that we dated, all the first generation and all the second generation of biotite. So what we said to them in the end was, look, some of these prospects, if you're really only seeing this age, my early suspicions are is they're not going to have enough gold for you for them to ever be economic. They just never had this very first event that seemed to be the most important one for that gold mineralization. So, 2 gold mineralizing events with probably different amounts? I'd probably say yes. And I'd say that had some big implications for where they were exploring at the time. Now, the last little bit I'll talk about, how much time have I got, Pete? Have I got enough? Or do you want me to wrap it up? Is just a couple of slides on what the future is. This is a fairly new technique, like some of these other techniques we've talked about this afternoon. Is what we have here is a potential new generation of machine. Bruno showed a slide on the NEOMA before. Able to do things with high precision. So a quadrupole, a triple quadrupole, is a single collector that essentially oscillates rapidly through your different isotopes that you want to measure. This thing, if you like, the advanced model of this, is a multi-collector, meaning you can spend the full amount of time on every single isotope that you want to measure. And there's been a few development issues, but as Bruno said, it's going to be here early next year. And hopefully we'll be able to take things, particularly for those lower rubidium-bearing minerals like your K feldspars, like some muscovites, we'll be able to get that precision a lot higher. It might also make some improvement to things like biotite with a relatively high amount of rubidium. Here's some of these early findings here. They've got Shap granite, which I think Jana talked about as well, I think.
Yeah, I did.
I heard Shap at some point. I was out the door at that point, but apologies. But you can see you get a nice, certainly a nice H on Shap as well, using both plagioclase, which is a little tiny inset in the corner here, and K feldspar. So I'm quite personally, I think Milo himself is also quite keen on this. Is the ability to date Precambrian sediment rapidly, right? One thing that probably hasn't been mentioned, at least in the afternoon session, is how quickly we can do laser ablation. You can do 400 analyses in a day with relative ease, right? So you can do multiple samples in a single day, which the solution method would have taken you weeks to be able to complete. Months. Best case scenario, right? So we can date things like glauconite with, as Isabel would say, mixed results. Potentially illite as well. That's something that's just been started at the top. Illite's a common mineral that we can date with potassium argon. To be able to date when Precambrian deposition, or at least early or deep burial diagenesis occurred, anything in the scale of 10 million years after burial. We can, and this is another really exciting passageway. If you stick sulfur hexafluoride gas in that reaction cell, what you can actually do is you can actually do some double dating. Now, we've heard of potassium argon dating, but if you heard of potassium calcium dating, actually 89% of all potassium 40 that decays turns into 40 calcium. Only 10% really decays into 40 argon. And this is some of the early work that people did on very old rocks. Is you can actually take, if you like, isochrons for both. So on here you've got this 40 calcium or 42 calcium, 40 potassium or 42 calcium. Here you have your normal rubidium strontium isochron, and you get essentially the same H. the precision, particularly for the younger rocks, when you're starting to get into the Proterozoic, this potassium calcium dating method is really imprecise. But with this new generation of machines, maybe we can kind of overcome those imprecisions, even turn it into a Concordia plot, much like uranium lead works. This is, as far as I'm aware, the only isochron ever made for potassium, potassium calcium and rubidium strontium. Note they're kind of in inverse here, by Ian Fletcher. And look, again, not too precise at the time, lots of discordant things. But certainly the math isn't that complex. You've got two isotopic systems that have about an order of magnitude difference in decay constant, which gives you this beautiful curve. Should be relatively straightforward to use as long as we can get the analytical side of measuring these things right. And so we can bring things like micas in here, K-feldspar, but also other potassium variables. So just to summarize, my final little work is, look, rubidium strontium geochron is making a comeback after it took a nosedive in the 80s and 90s. It's come back, but without the need for desegregation. A little case study that we had is we seem to see two potentially gold mineralizing events, or at least one major one and one minor one. And there's three sort of, I guess, things for the future, if you like. One is this development of multi-collector reaction cells is going to be enable us to, I guess, target new minerals, but also obtain really precise numbers from other things. And implications into double dating and things like Precambrian deposition, metamorphic histories, all kinds of different avenues. That's all.